Tim Shriver is probably best known as Chair of Special Olympics. Under his leadership, the organization has grown to include more than 4 million athletes in countries from the US to China to India. But he got his start as a teacher, and his experience in the classroom has informed his lifelong commitment to kids and learning. Along with his Special Olympics work, he is the founder of the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, working with students from preschool through high school. He is here to talk about that with the Atlantic's editor-in-chief, James Bennet.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
So, Tim, Mark Brackett earlier gave a great overview describing the relationship between emotion and cognition and how our emotional state affects students, teachers, and parents as well. And I'm hoping we can use this conversation to put a little more structure around our thinking about this, how these insights actually can be and are being applied in school systems, and also a little bit about where some of the resistance to these ideas may lie. But I'd love to start out just by hearing your story about how you came to these insights yourself as a teacher in Hill House High School in New Haven.
Well, thank you for asking. I've been trying to tell this story to my children for 20 years, and none of them want to listen to it, but I promise not to take the full time for that.
Thank you for not saying it was a false question.
Yeah. Randy did a great job of that, wherever she is, and Mark did too, two great colleagues. Look, I started as a classroom teacher. I worked in compensatory ed right out of college, actually in college, in an upward bound program, high potential, high risk kids. Moved into the school system to try to work on supportive after school programs. You know, basically working in an average American urban neighborhood where there's lots of risk, lots of chaos, lots of resilience, lots of joy. Trying to figure out how to bring those two things together. I think the pivotal moment for me was when I went to study with Jim Comer. I took a fellowship at the Yale Child Studies Center. And the big idea Dr. Comer introduced me to was the idea of child development. You know, his argument was that like medicine, you know, he's trained as a doctor, medical doctor, child psychiatrist. Medicine has a basic science. And in medicine, if you get in trouble, everybody knows anatomy. Everybody can rely on anatomy. Everybody can draw on the science of anatomy in order to solve problems. He said educators don't have a basic science. And that science, but they ought to have a basic science. They ought to have a grounding science, and it ought to be the science of child development. Child development would orient schools and educators to be able to understand the fundamental developmental trajectory children follow, and to be able to support that development in positive ways. So he took the issue of risk, underachievement, problem behaviors, and converted it into a developmental agenda. His most powerful teaching slide for me was he would draw a picture of an A, the letter A, and then he would draw a picture of a squiggly line. And he would say, if you're a kindergartner and you see this squiggly line and you see this A, tell me what the difference is for you. You're 5 years old and you see two shapes. What's the difference? And the answer is there's only one difference. A significant adult about whom you care wants you to learn the meaning of one of them and does not care if you learn the meaning of the other. His point being very simply that the primary engine of learning is the relationship between the child and the teacher. The teacher says to the child, this shape here can be used for your advantage, can help you communicate, can help you understand the world. This shape here is irrelevant. And so the child gravitates toward the A and becomes engaged in learning what the A means. If you think about that, if I can shift quickly to the issue of risk, most of the work being done in risk up till that point, this is in the late 70s and early 80s, and I'm sad to say much of it continuing, was not developmentally sound. It was focused on interventions that were project-based, often assemblies, outreach workers, intervention strategies, and so on. It was not developmental. It didn't look at the 5-year-old coming into school or the 4-year-old coming into preschool and say, how can we strengthen the relationship between that child and that teacher so that the content that child needs to master can be effectively communicated. When you looked at, we had, you know, in those days there was teen pregnancy prevention, there was substance abuse prevention, violence prevention, truancy prevention. I was handed responsibility for all of them. and we commissioned reports to look at what was going on. Why were so many kids truant? Why were so many kids violent? Why were so many kids dropping out? Why were so many kids having unwanted pregnancies, et cetera, et cetera? And, you know, shock and surprise, they all had common underlying developmental pathways. And you could look at the co-occurrence of risk factors across all of them, and yet we had 6 and 7 and 8 different prevention programs that were all operating at cross purposes. And so for me, I was looking at the kids, and Jim Comer's in the back of my mind saying, you need to look at children and how you can help them develop, not at problem behaviors individually and how you can stop them. And that became, that coming together of a developmental perspective and the desire to help kids who had risk and vulnerability became the seed of the idea of social and emotional learning as a core part of teaching.
And before we go to the question of how you then take these ideas to scale, how did you specifically apply those insights that feed them into your own teaching in the schools?
I had nothing to go on, right? We created a comprehensive a Department of Primary Prevention, which was the first in the country, the first that I know of in the world. We closed down most of the intervention programs to some political risk. And we decided to try to write a kindergarten through 12th grade scope and sequence that would treat the acquisition of social and emotional skills, values, and attitudes the same way we taught English. So if we want the child to learn the A, the E, the I, the O, the U, and then 13 years later be reading a Shakespearean sonnet, we had to teach in a sequential way for 13 years, right? If you want a child to learn to identify his or her feelings or his or her stressors, and by the time they get 13 years later to be able to manage the complexities of work or adult life or community living or voting or service or character or anything else, you have to do the same thing. So we decided to try to implement a kindergarten through 12th grade brand new, never been developed, social and emotional learning curriculum and support it with after-school activities, parent engagement, and community involvement. It was in some ways a crazy large project, some successes, many failures, but the basic idea of embedding into getting out of intervention, which schools do poorly, and into prevention, which is fundamentally what schools do well, development, that's what we're supposed to be as educators good at, and making prevention a coordinated project and a comprehensive one, not an episodic or a programmatic one. Those insights, I think, are still animating and challenging the field today.
So how can they be put into practice system-wide?
Well, I think, you know, with CASEL, we have 8 large collaborating districts, we call them. Not model districts, not demonstration districts, collaborating districts, because this is fundamentally a learning process. I was in Nashville last week, Cleveland the week before. What we're trying to do, great superintendents trying to integrate back to the basics, the whole child into the entire school reform strategy. So what are they doing? They're trying to build a comprehensive scope and sequence so that every child beginning in kindergarten and through 12th grade will have exposure to the kind of training in classrooms, both embedded in academic content and discrete skills training in classrooms. The teachers will have the support to do that. So that's the classroom piece. Then there's the climate and culture piece, which includes issues around student agency, arts and student leadership programs, restorative justice practices, so the skills being taught in classrooms can be modeled and embedded into the culture of the school, and the climate begins to become supportive of children. And then there's a community piece where you try to integrate that with what community-based organizations and families are doing at home.
So I'm just pushing for just a concrete example.
I'm not getting the answer.
I'm getting it. No, but I'd like a better, like a concrete understanding of how a kid in a classroom in the course of his academic instruction can be taught some of the things Mark was talking about recognizing and naming emotions and learning to regulate the emotions. Is there a way, is there an example from teaching reading or math that would incorporate these insights? Sure.
So if you look at the Common Core, there's actually embedded in the Common Core, I mean, maybe I'll get in trouble here because it's such a divisive issue, but not many people argue about the substance of the Common Core. They argue a lot about the implementation and the testing and the training and stuff. But if you look at the substance of the Common Core, you'll see things like, for instance, teaching something that almost everybody in this room would have been taught, persuasive writing. Okay, so if you don't just teach writing skills the way much of the testing much of the testing world wants us to learn it today, but you actually have to teach and model and be evaluated on persuasive writing. What do you have to do to be a persuasive writer? You have to know your audience. So you have to have some degree of empathy, some degree of capacity to intuit or understand another point of view. You also have to have some desire to express your own point of view. So you have to know yourself. What do I believe strongly? What's important to me? You have to be able to figure out a communication strategy around how to persuade. Now, you can say, well, I learned that without a social and emotional learning curriculum. Well, actually, you didn't. You learned it with a social and emotional learning curriculum. It was largely implicit if you learned persuasive writing, which theoretically, given your position, you learned. But embedded in, embedded in the capacity to sell a magazine is the capacity to communicate with your readers, right? So there are many ways in which you could teach, for instance, empathy skills in a discrete format. You could teach children how to dialogue, how to repeat back what I'm feeling, how to help the other child understand the capacity, your own point of view. That's teaching empathy in a dedicated, skill-centered way. Very important. But then you can apply that in terms of trying to write an editorial for your middle school newspaper about trying to persuade the principal to allow students to do the announcements at school. You have to understand the principal's point of view in the same way you just learned the skill. I mean, I was in a completely different setting. I was in a classroom in Austin. The whole week was devoted to how to say I'm sorry. And I thought to myself, geez, I mean, I'm into this stuff, but that sounds a little bit too much. Like, I mean, really? Come on, I'm sorry is like, I'm sorry, right? I didn't answer your question yet, I'm sorry. As it turns out, this teacher was quite a genius in helping the children to see all the different dimensions of conflict that arise from misplaced apologies and unintended subtle meaning in apologies. And he did this beautiful thing about, I'm sorry if I offended you. We see this in politicians all the time, right? Now we're on to it, that what that means is it was your problem, right? But if you're a 9th grader and you're struggling in school and people are making fun of you and they come up to you and say, I'm sorry that you feel like I'm bullying you, you wimp, you know enough to know that didn't work, right? And you know also enough to know the difference between that and someone coming up to you and saying, hey, I made a big mistake, I'm sorry. Now, he was teaching these skills in a dedicated classroom. A classroom specifically focused for all 9th graders on social and emotional learning. I won't get the data right. He's taught it for 2 years as part of this comprehensive CASEL strategy. Discipline referrals are down something like 80%. Every 9th grader gets this class. Now that's a particular implementation strategy that not every school district will use, but you have a master teacher teaching in a brilliant way, unlocking kids, de-stressing the environment, giving them access to help when they need it, and all of a sudden, the huge amount of stress that goes into the transition to high school for any kid is reduced, and the chances of learning are vastly increased.
I'm going to open it up to you guys in just a second, but one more question. I mean, back when I was a kid, I always assumed that the emotional secret to academic success was to feel anxious and stressed out all the time.
Right.
But listening to you and Mark talk, everything you say makes perfect, it just seems like common sense.
Right.
So where is the resistance to this set of ideas coming from?
Well, I think most of it's coming from antiquated models of teaching. So we still have in people's heads the idea that teaching is bolting on a part onto a machine. So I have knowledge of algebra. This is a machine here. It comes down the line. I bolt it on and it keeps going. It's completely forgetful of development, but we still operate that way. So there's resistance to saying, well, wait a minute, how can we spend time on the motivation of the child when we want to teach algebra? Well, wait a minute. You want to motivate the child to learn algebra, don't you? That's a false choice. That's resistance number one. Resistance number two is the culture we've created in schools, the focus on testing and all that, which I don't have to repeat here. I think that's yielding because I think there's a huge hunger for a new paradigm. I think the current debate is running out of gas, myself. I don't think there's much new being said about the angry, vitriolic debate between defenders of traditional public education and innovators on the on the punitive side. I mean, I think basically everybody's saying, okay, well, we ran down that road. Isn't there a new idea? I think the new idea is let's focus on teaching and learning. So that's a piece of the resistance is the old political debate. Time and pressure is part of this, and the lack of understanding. And in fairness to teachers and educators, we in our field are only now getting clear on what we mean. I mean, this has been a field driven by innovation over the last 30 years. Mark's program is, I don't know, 10 years old, but not 30 or 40. So this is a field largely dominated by creative thinkers who are doing new work. We now have to get our point of view, I think, much more coherently framed for policymakers so that whether it's a superintendent or a board of education or a governor or a legislator at the national level, they can understand what we're trying to argue for and hopefully adapt public policy to accommodate it.
Let's try to get in a question here.
Good morning, Josh Starr, PDK International. And first, Tim, I very much appreciate your advocacy and leadership on this for many years. One of my concerns about the SEL movement, and I'm, as you know, very, very supportive of it, is that it's going to become subject to some measures that may not be appropriate, character report cards, things like that. And as we seek to measure almost everything now in public education, which in many ways has a lot of good aspects to it, where do you see the role of sort of measuring it, the possibility of report cards, and this kind of idea that may actually work against what it is you and Castle are trying to do?
Well, I think it's a great question, and as many of you probably know, Josh was terrific and led really on his own around this in the Montgomery County School District. The issue of accountability and measurement are two different issues. I mean, it's hard to distinguish them, but they're not the same. There are good measures. The problem is there are too many. There's not one good measure. American policymakers like, okay, give me the one I can use to write the law, to fund the project, to evaluate its outcome. There are, and the answer to that is we as a field have not yet created what, at least to my knowledge, the measure which we'd like to think is the best one to hold our field accountable. But in the end of the day, the most important measure in schools is academic learning. I don't think we're here to say, I'm not here to say, it's not important that children learn to read and write, or do math, or punctuate a sentence, or understand the periodic table. I want my kids to learn all that. Kids need to learn that. So ultimately, our most important measure is, are we motivating kids to learn? And therefore, in some crazy kind of chemistry, at the end of the day, whatever the academic measure is, should be our measure too. I'm willing to say there are proxies, for instance, around school safety, around sense of caring in schools, around student agency, the sense in which students feel that their own ideas matter, that teachers care about them. There are lots of ways we can monitor that from very early grades so that it helps teachers be responsive to kids in new and better ways. But if everybody's singing, in the caricature of us is that everybody's singing Kumbaya and nobody's learning. We have explosive self-esteem and academic incompetence. That's not a vision for this field, and it never has been. Most of the people that came into this field, certainly on the school side, a little bit less on the project design side, we came into education because we wanted to teach. I mean, we didn't necessarily start out thinking we wanted to teach coping skills or problem solving or stress management or consequential thinking or empathy or feelings identification. We came in, most of us, wanting to teach the Civil War or the periodic table or Maya Angelou or something like that. So I think in the end of the day, we have to be accountable for academic learning. And if we enhance it, we should be rewarded for it, and the program should be supported. And if we don't, I think we need to rethink it.
Take another one over here, please. Go ahead.
Good morning. Jane Ehrenfeld, Center for Inspired Teaching. In our work with pre-service and in-service teachers, and also we have a demonstration school here in DC, we talk a lot about courageous conversations and the importance of engaging students in questions about the toughest issues of our day: Ferguson, gun violence, poverty.
Right.
What's your thinking in your work around those issues, and how do we get students talking in a way that's safe but also challenging about these issues?
Yeah, so you get a predictable answer from me. Those are obviously really important conversations. They're important conversations for the culture, for families, and certainly for schools. I think the risk, again, I mean, to some extent, we're probably in a room of the converted here. There are a lot of people who aren't converted, and when they hear a question like that, they're going to hear, okay, so we're going to spend 3 months talking about Ferguson, and no one's going to, again, learn the periodic table or that, you know, where to place a comma versus a semicolon and stuff like that. I think courageous conversations are important, but we have to remember, I believe, that they have to drive towards fundamental academic learning, particularly for the most vulnerable kids, right? So these are the kids that when they can't punctuate a sentence can't get a job. They may have very well identified feelings about Ferguson, but they can't get a job because they can't write with a subject-verb agreement. So I think we have to be pretty sanguine about the importance of the basics. For me, the Ferguson conversation, for instance, a courageous conversation about Ferguson, is a way of bringing the child into the room. Because if the child is in Ferguson, whether that child is African American or Latino or white, or whether that child lives in Missouri or lives in California, if the child is in Ferguson, if the child is beset by fear, anxiety, frustration, anger, from any of the political perspectives that dominated the Ferguson conversation, then the child's not there. The child literally is not there. The brain science now tells us this. If the emotion drives attention, and attention drives learning, if the emotional connection to the matter at hand isn't there, the child physiologically will not learn. It's not like you can say, come on, pay attention. If the child's emotional life is elsewhere, they can't. It's not that they won't, they can't. So we need the Ferguson conversations, just like any master teacher would have always known that when you start the day, you try to integrate what's going on in the world, in life, in the community, in the neighborhood, in the school, into bringing the child into the room so that the child can be present enough to learn whatever it is the social studies teacher is teaching, or the math teacher, or a non-departmentalized teacher is teaching. So, I mean, I think we have to make sure we remind teachers that they do have license for courageous conversation and that that's not time off task. But at the same time, my view is, at least from my point of view, that the bringing in of the supportive conversation has to still drive towards our responsibility for basic learning.
All right, I think the notion of equipping people for courageous conversation is an aspirational one to leave this on. So thank you very much,
you.
Tim.
Thank you.
Everybody.